Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on this episode, it's all about company culture. And we're going to be talking with Curnow from the company CultureWise about what it takes to build a great culture. What do great organizations share in regards to how they create it, how they sustain it, and how they drive it? So let's get into it. Al, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. I've really been looking forward to this conversation around culture, because even though we talk about it a lot, I do think that there's a lot of confusion around what is it that culture really means. And it means different things to different people. So that's your specialty. I'd love for us to start out from that space and then talk about what are the systems in place that we create culture within organizations.
Thank you very much for having me on. A pleasure being here. And yeah, when it comes to the definition of culture, I think if you asked a room full of 50 people, you're likely to get 50 different definitions. And each one of them probably being a bit fuzzy, maybe a bit ambiguous. And historically, culture has been one of those things that's just difficult to define, which is a bit problematic because in our experience, working with close to 700 organizations, we find that it's incredibly important and incredibly influential on everything an organization does, a person does. And so from our standpoint, when we look at defining culture, we feel that the clearer and the more specific we can be, the better. Because when you think about it, culture really is, I love one of the definitions I've heard. It's kind of what happens amongst our team members when we're not in the room, right? That's the culture. And I know you are too, Patrick, but I'm a big sports fan, use a lot of sports analogies. If I'm a basketball coach, my culture isn't me with my team in a pregame or pre-practice huddle. It's my players in the locker room without me there, right? Or what happens after practice. From our standpoint, all the more reason we as leaders need to be very clear and influential in defining our culture. And culture really being how we do the things we do. If you look at it from a corporate standpoint, it's particularly in industries that are highly commoditized. It's not the widget, it's not the screw, it's not the wrench we manufacture. It's how we deliver it. If you look in the hospitality industry, it's not necessarily our thread count on our sheets, although that's important to some. It's what's the experience I get when I stay at that particular hotel. So again, for us, it comes back to, as leaders of organizations, being really clear in beginning to define what our culture is, as opposed to letting it just grow and morph as it will, without our influence.
Yeah. And it's interesting as I heard you talking about that, I think in regards to when you ask people what their culture is, they can also say what their culture is by definition, but if their behaviors don't align with that, it doesn't matter what you say your culture is, your behaviors will trump whatever you want to say your culture is.
Absolutely, Patrick. And I go a step further, and not only will it trump it, it can become dangerous and problematic if what we say as leaders our culture is, and if there's a misalignment in terms of what it actually is and what actually happens, that's why people leave. I came to work for you, Patrick, because you told me we have a culture of collaboration and teamwork. We have each other's backs, right? And the second I find out it's anything other than that, that you don't support me as leader, or I'm surrounded by a bunch of teammates with big egos that don't care, I'm out of there. Right. And so, to your point, oftentimes what we say our culture is and what's actually happening can be two very different things.
Yeah. I'm going to volley back onto you for that one. Have you seen a difference since COVID? And I always hesitate now to just go back to, I feel like it's BC in the terms of before COVID now. That's what BC stands for.
Uh-huh.
But have you noticed a difference in terms of organizationally, what people are willing to tolerate and how this is revealing itself?
Yeah, in a few different ways, Patrick. It's a great question. One, I think just generally, not just amongst our clients, but just based on my own personal anecdotal experience, people generally are operating at a much higher emotionally charged level. It seems like our collective patience is a bit thinner than it used to be. Our tolerance. I think you probably do the same. I do a lot of travel in my work, so I'm always on crowded airplanes, airports, and that's where you really begin to see it firsthand. We see some elements of that, but what we've also seen is since COVID, we've never been busier. In fact, we've had unbelievable growth since COVID, because I do believe it's forcing leaders to think about that, right? To think about the subject, to think about their culture. They're either dealing with remote employees, hybrid employees, or they're struggling to recruit or hire or retain. And all of those things kind of come back to that underlying culture. So it's interesting. So we've seen impact in a couple different ways. In the end, it's presented a lot of opportunities for us to kind of help and coach and guide.
Yeah, it's interesting when you mention that. I think of a book that I read during my graduate work in leadership. And it was, I won't get the title exactly right, but it was along the lines of the light versus shadows in leadership. And when we expose the light on things, that's when we start to see what's really there. And to your point, I think, is the light has been shown in a lot of areas that it was hidden before. It was in the shadows, and it can't be anymore.
You're absolutely right. And, all indications are things are changing a bit now in terms of the labor market, but it's amazing what an incredibly tight shrinking market will do, right? In terms of that, and enhancing or awakening leaders thinking around the subject of culture. Because you're right. I think it's when it's in the light of day, I think we tend to view things
you have to look at
it differently.
Yeah. I had heard somebody not that long ago, this was an organization I was in, and they were talking about turnover and a lot of the things going around this quiet quitting. And once the economy changes and the labor market tightens up, their thought was a lot of that stuff would go away. What are your thoughts on that?
From my personal experience, kind of a narrow perspective, if you will, I don't know if I totally agree with that. I think there are a couple factors. I think one thing COVID has done is it's kind of awoken all of us, right? A lot of us have kind of taken a look back inside and say, what's important, what thinking in terms of meaning and impact and those. So I think they're here to stay. I don't think that's something that ebbs and flows with an economy or a market and so forth. So there's that. But I'd also say, and I'd say this as the dad of a sophomore in college and a senior in high school, our youth, our next team up, right, just view the world differently. And again, I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon. In fact, I think that's just going to kind of heighten the importance of all of this. So yeah, there might be some short-term blips, I guess, in terms of rates of quitting and retention and so forth. But long-term, I don't know. I think some of these things are here to stay.
Yeah. And I would agree with you. And the conversation that went on after that was my belief that although the physical numbers of people leaving an organization might change, my belief is that this will just go back underground again, in that we'll just have disengaged individuals that have quit, but they didn't go anywhere because they didn't have an opportunity to. And I think those are going to be worse because then they will resent the fact that other people got out and they're stuck in an organization that they should have left when they had the chance.
Oh my gosh. And the collateral damage when that happens, Patrick, is huge, as you know. And in fact, I recently conducted a webinar on the topic. And so I don't have the statistics at hand, but they're mind-boggling. You know, the impact with that phenomenon and on those around them. When you have that one who's just can't leave or won't leave, yet is unhappy, disengaged, what that can do to our best people, right? That's where it becomes really problematic and dangerous, because our best people can move, can leave, right? They're our most talented. So it creates a very problematic dynamic when that's going on. So yeah, it's a dangerous thing.
On your site, you talk about high-performing organizations really doing three things. That it's about creating, driving, and then sustaining culture. Yeah. And I was wondering if we could step on each of those,
sure,
just to get a better understanding for those people that are out there who are saying, how do I go about this in terms of culture and developing it?
Again, it begins, at least with our approach, it begins with creating clarity in defining and taking ownership of your culture. As you know, we see the responsibility, particularly for the most senior leader of an organization, right? A president, an executive director. Same could apply within a department or on a team, though, Patrick, the leader of that team, but we see it as their responsibility to draw the line in the sand, put the white stake in the ground, use whatever analogy you want to use, but it's the responsibility of senior leadership to define clarity in terms of, okay, what is our culture? What do we want it to be? What are the elements of our culture that are just non-negotiable? And what are the elements that perhaps might be a bit more aspirational where we need to grow? But in our experience, it absolutely and positively has to start there. Because until we've taken the time to do that, I'd argue we're operating in the shadows, right? As you referenced before, we're operating there, or we're operating on hunches, best guesses, and so forth. And what's really interesting about that is that even some great companies haven't necessarily gone that far, because historically what most organizations have done to try to establish and define their culture is they'll create a mission value statement, they'll establish some core values, and while that can be good and important, particularly if they're meaningful and they actually live to what they are espousing, in our experience, not enough. Take, for example, you look at core values, Patrick, and in just about everyone's core value statement, you'll see something about respect, something about integrity, which incredibly important, yet tend to be vague and ambiguous. For example, if my workforce consists of, let's say we have 25 people in my company, and 5 come from an urban area, 5 come from a rural area, maybe I have a few international employees amongst my group. And if I were to ask every one of my team members, what does respect mean to you? I'd highly likely get 25 different definitions. Whereas if we can be more clear and more specific and focus on the behaviors we're looking to drive, those things mean the same things to all people. What are the behaviors we're looking to drive that speak to respect?
Right.
Is it listening generously? Is it being clear on expectations? Is it honoring our commitments and doing what we say we're going to do? So if we can operate on that level and create the language that we can use with each other and our team members, it helps us be better leaders. It creates clarity for our team members, and it really gives us something that we can do something with and measure. But again, in our experience, most organizations haven't gone that far. And so that's something we're very involved with. That's really the first step when we're working with an organization, is getting at that, because it has to start there.
I love to hear you say that. And from my perspective, I fully agree with you. I look at mission, vision, values as such a missed opportunity with most organizations, And I've been in those organizations where cynically I looked at them and said, we don't stand for any of these things. We have this nice printout and plaque and whatever it is, and it's on our badges in some places. And I think it's even worse when it's on your badge and you feel like people don't model those behaviors, because now you're reminded of it on a daily basis, how out of alignment the organization is.
So true, Yet the opposite can be true as well.
Without question.
Right? If we truly live to them. And in our experience, it's challenging to live to them if we don't have enough clarity in terms of what they mean and how we can practice them and what they mean to us on a day-to-day basis, right? And so that's where there tends to be a disconnect.
Yeah.
But in our experience, also an enormous opportunity, right, to really begin to kind of leverage and harness and define your culture.
Yeah. I think that's such a great exercise too for you to do, because it involves people. So now it's not just words, it's asking people, what do you think? How does this impact you? And now you get buy-in because people don't feel like it's just being sent down on high, that they're part of this process of what do these really look like?
Patrick, you're so right. And it's interesting because something happens when we're given a voice, and regardless of whether or not we end up at the same place, right? So in other words, if an organization is trying to define that set of behaviors that they're looking to drive, even if we would have ended up with that same list, regardless of that participation or involvement, it brings it to a whole other level when it's coming from us, when we've had a voice. And that ownership is key, Patrick, particularly when you come to that next step in the process is, okay, once you define it, then how do you integrate it, really drive it, and so forth. And so having that ownership in the first place can really help along those lines.
Yeah, I love it. And along those lines, when I think of mission, vision, values about this missed opportunity, because I look and think, what an easy way for us to really have a roadmap for this organization. I can look back and say, are my behaviors right now, are they in line with what we say we stand for, what our values are? And the decisions we're making as an organization right now, we need to make this difficult decision. Is this in alignment with what we say we stand for as an organization? Boom.
Oh, absolutely, Patrick. And it's interesting because, in addition to being consultants on the topic, we're practitioners as well. And so I can tell you firsthand, when you have that language and awareness, it's almost inescapable, like in a good way. I don't mean that. So
exactly.
I'll be in a meeting with 3 or 4 of my teammates, and we're trying to solve a customer related issue. And I'll find myself saying in that meeting, without having to even think about it, if we're going to do what's best for our customer, we should probably be thinking about X, Y, Z. And I don't think it's by accident or a fluke thing that I'm actually thinking through that lens, because one of our, what we call fundamentals, we call our key core behaviors, fundamental behaviors. One of our fundamentals is always do what's best for the customer. And so when you have that level of clarity and you're continually focusing on it, you're always aware. So as incidents arise, I don't have to go check my guidebook and see it's there. It just becomes how we do things. That's the power. But again, you have to first start with being very clear in terms of what those things are before you can really do much meaningfully about it.
Yeah. On that last point, I'm going to jump to the end of sustain, because I think you being able to leverage those, right? You being able to sort of refer back to that, to me is about it's sustained. This isn't just a nice thing we've put on the wall. It's like you go to the gym training to build these muscles.
That's it. And kind of in between those two, Patrick, right? In the definition and sustaining, probably one of the most important in terms of, all right, how do we drive it? How do we implement a process that reinforces it? And that's really, to me, at least for our recipe, that's the secret sauce, right? To get you from defining and sustaining that necessary part, the thing that's going to get us to the gym, even on those days that we don't really feel like it, is that second piece in terms of how we can drive it.
Anything that you would suggest, biggest mistakes that you see organizations making in the drive component of this?
Well, yes. So our approach with the drive component is, it's interesting. We utilize a fairly simple, straightforward, yet incredibly powerful approach and concept in that we help client organizations establish what we call rituals. And rituals has no religious connotation, simply means we help our client organizations create practices, routines, and habits to help their leaders and team members stay focused on those important behaviors. And it's a really interesting and effective approach, Patrick, in that what our client organizations will do is they'll come up with a set of core fundamental behaviors, and they might have anywhere from 15 to 30 of them. But each and every week, they focus on one of them per week, organizationally wide. And they do that through any combination or some combination of rituals or practices. It might be something as simple as some weekly messaging, getting a message out to all team members. Hey, team, this week we're focused on XYZ. Other clients will do some interesting things like start every meeting or certain meetings, department meetings, staff meetings, client meetings, with a brief discussion about that week's behavior, that week's fundamental. Some will use technology, different ways of using technology to reinforce it. And they do that every week, over and over and over. And when they get to the end of their list, they start all over again. And they do it over and over and over. And this approach isn't novel or new necessarily. In fact, you're probably familiar with Ritz-Carlton and their daily basics approach, where every day, every property around the world, every shift change, they discuss one guest-centric idea per day. Think about the power of that. You know, whether you are in Singapore or London or Boston, to know that those team members are focused on delivering, right, whatever that one concept is organizationally wide. So ours is kind of in fact, we were heavily influenced by that model when we developed ours. But once you've established that framework where you're focusing, it allows you and your team members to stay focused and continually improve and kind of sharpen our skill set when it comes to those respective behaviors. So I think that's an important point. That's an important framework. And so going way back to your question, Patrick, where do we see client organizations falling short when it comes to really driving it? It's there. They don't have a framework or a process in place. They might talk about these important things, but they don't have a systematic way of really operationalizing them. They might do a training program now and then. It gets hot for 30 days and then it goes cold. And that, in our experience, tends to be the norm versus the exception. And they just haven't developed or even thought about a systematic way of keeping those important things front and center.
Yeah. I have found that it's worse to do the 30-day rah-rahs than to do nothing at all. And I think long-term, I always equate it back to antibiotic treatment. And if you think about going for antibiotic treatment, right, you're told if it's 10 days, even if you're feeling better, take it all. Because if you don't, it's either coming back or worse, you're going to become resistant. And I think the same thing has happened in the world of training, is that most people, they get a little bump, they feel good. I don't need to take the rest. We don't need to continue to run this thing out. We got it from here. And then what happens is they become resistant. So next thing that gets implemented, employees are like, oh my God, here we go again. Like flavor of the month. It's not going to work.
100%, Patrick. Yet when you look at the best companies, the great sports teams with the long history of success, they're all about that continued focus, because they'll have players come in and out, not always necessarily the top skill positions, but because their culture is so strong and those expectations are so clear, they just benefit from that continued focus. And you're right. And it's interesting because when we're rolling out our process to our client organizations, I take that head on initially because I'll be in there with a room full of employees, Patrick. And you can tell by the look of their faces. Here we go again. Yeah. You know what? Let's give this 30 days. We can wait this one out too. But I take it right
exactly,
out, right? And I'll say, look, this is different because this is about creating you're already good. This is about creating a great team for a sustained period of time. That's a higher level of commitment and responsibility. And to do that, we can't leave it to our own devices because it's going to be just like the New Year's resolutions we broke 6 months ago. Yeah. And the way we're going to prevent that was, we've got this framework, we've got this process, so we never lose sight of what's important. And we continually get better. We continually talk about those things that are important until they just become kind of what we do, how we do it. But we never stop also because as we add new team members, they need that clarity too. They need to know what to expect coming onto our team because our team's different than probably any other they've been involved with before. And there's real power in that. And team members get that as well. Once they see it, they get it. Now, the next important thing, Patrick, kind of going back to your original question of potential spots for problem areas, is as long as we're sustaining those practices and rituals, as leaders, we need to make sure, we're leading by example and we're protecting that line in the sand that we drew. So, for example, what does a leader do if one of their team members says, yeah, those behaviors, good for you, but not important to me? Or worse, what if they continue to operate in a way that's completely counter to all those things we said is important? And that's where and when leadership has to be willing sometimes to make really difficult decisions in terms of, all right, is this person a fit for my team in terms of what I'm looking to build and grow? And those decisions are a bit easier if those team members are underperformers. But what do we do if it's your top sales guy? Or it's one of your team members who manages your largest account, and the account loves them, but they're wreaking havoc on the rest of your team and they're becoming toxic. So that's the other area. I think organizations are vulnerable if they haven't been clear in establishing what they're building, they don't have a process to reinforce it, and if their leaders don't lead with it and really draw that line when necessary.
I'm glad you say that because I do find that it exposes unfairness within an organization. And even if employees don't say anything, they see it and they think, boy, Sue or Jim, they don't have to follow the same rules as the rest of us are, and nobody's calling them out on it. Doesn't fly.
And it happens all the time. And it's really interesting too, because, we've worked with our client organizations and coached them through some of those things. And it's funny, when that happens and when the leadership ultimately makes the right decision in those cases, as difficult as they sometimes are, the result is always the same. The team members around them breathe a sigh of relief, saying, about time. And then the leaders, pretty much without exceptions, will always say, gosh, darn it, I wish I did that 6 months ago or a year ago. And it's interesting, Patrick, because we're not one of those who approaches things like, you've got to get rid of 10% of your workforce today. We're all about coaching up, right? And skill improvement, development, all boats rise. But the reality of any organization is from time to time, you're going to have that apple or two that we need to deal with if we're really serious about creating an extraordinary culture. And another definition, going back to how defining culture, one of the definitions I love, and I don't know who this is credited to, but there's a saying that the true definition of your culture is the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate as leader of that organization.
I like that.
So in other words, if I came to visit your company or your organization or your team and I knew nothing about you and I spent some time with you behind the scenes, without the leaders in the room, so on and so forth, and what I witnessed as the worst behavior is how I'm going to, define your organization. So that's to me, I think an insightful and accurate description.
And I would actually argue that you owe it. There's a responsibility you have to that whatever that person looks like, they're not in the right place. So you are not serving them well by having them remain. It works in both organizations' best interest to have that person leave. It opens up the spot for somebody that should be there. It sets a precedent for other people to say, okay, this company is serious about this stuff. Yeah. And it also lets that person, it releases them in a way to go somewhere else that's going to be a better fit for you.
So true, Patrick, because I mean, could you imagine if you worked in an environment where everything you believed in it, everything you performed was counter to what was being stressed and I mean,
I did.
You're right. And it's not healthy. And sometimes we get stuck, right? Or we need the payback, and that can be hard. So to have a leader to be able to identify that and help, because you're right. I think we do owe it to that team member, and to get them on a path that's right for them. And that's the thing, it's not a good or bad or right or wrong. It's really more a fit. And so sometimes it's just a matter of, some of our team members just might not fit with doesn't make them a bad person. In fact, likely flourish in the right fit in an organization that's the right fit for them.
That was my last organization. I was so unhappy. And I look back on it now in that the values that I held were not the same values that I was experiencing around me. And I didn't have the courage to make the jump that I wanted to make at that point until it was forced upon me, because it was comfortable. It was comfortable.
Yeah.
Great money.
How long were you there, Patrick? Just curious.
A total of 5 years. Which it didn't get, that part wasn't until the end that there was a misalignment between what I wanted and what I was receiving. And I said, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
It was a gift.
Yeah.
A gift.
Well, and the other element, and one thing that certainly has grown in terms of both an area of concern, of need, and of awareness is, kind of the whole wellness, right? I'm a big believer, supporter that, it kind of tend to look at things holistically. And when we're in a spot like that it's just not healthy, right? It's healthy for our mental or our physical well-being, and all of which, affect performance, but to me, more importantly, affect our health at the same time. And it can happen. But again, going back to establishing clarity as a leader of an organization, what it does too is it helps from the standpoint that those sorts of situations. So we've got a team member that's just not a fit. It does shine more light on them more quickly than it might. Hadn't we taken the time to provide the clarity and expectations of our team members, it kind of forces the issue a little bit, and I'd say in a good way, in a positive way.
I totally agree with you.
Make better decisions.
Totally agree. One other topic that I think was very interesting, especially as it relates to culture, in an environment where we're finding more remote work. How do we keep that together? What does that look like?
Yeah, great question. And I think one thing we've all learned, the answer is not necessarily another Zoom happy hour, right? Or, which, first one or two wasn't bad, but, right. And absent anything else. I think in our experience, what we've found, Patrick, is we just need to double down. And it, again, as basic as this one is, but it's putting those consistent channels of communication in play. It's providing opportunities to listen for our team members, particularly our remote team members, to be heard, providing those opportunities, those connection points, if you will, those regular, not just at the weekly check-in, but more frequently, more systematically. in our experience, that's the most critical. There's no short, it's an event here and there isn't going to do it. It's got to be more substantive, more consistent. And so having some sort of framework of some form of schedule, some form that isn't necessarily just this forced, but that provides those real opportunities to connect, to be heard, and to share at the same time, and kind of establish the flow. That's, to us, that's been one of the biggest factors.
Yeah, there's one thing that I have observed is that we don't know really what this is going to look like. I think the organizations that are best suited for navigating what culture will look like in a remote versus brick and mortar are those that stay curious and open to exploring how are we going to do this successfully and maintain an identity of who we are, a positive identity, but also in this new environment.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one, Patrick, because I can see both sides. Early on in COVID, I had clients who were adamant that they're going to keep their employees at work as long as they can. They're going to bring them back as quickly as they can. And then I had others that were much more open in terms of, okay, I can see, there are certain advantages and benefits of just being with others, and if you probably can recall the author's name in Culture Code.
Dan Coyle.
Dan Coyle, that whole idea of bumping into each other, creating an environment where, right, we're just bumping
the water
into
cooler.
The water cooler. We share things happen. There's a certain magic to that. So we lose that. Therefore, we need to be mindful of how do we, in a remote basis, again, replace those connection points and establish those so it won't be the same, but we can get close as long as we're mindful of it and, to your point, flexible in terms of it. And the whole other element of it, I look at it too, is we all perform differently. I don't know about you, but I've always worked remote.
Same here.
I think in my long career, with the exception of 2 years, I think 2 years of my entire career did I ever. But this isn't for everybody. Some need that structure, need that separation, need to go. Believe me, I have days.
Some days it doesn't work for me.
So there's that element too. But to your point, I think best strategy is to try to be open-minded as you can, recognizing the realities of your business. Right? Some businesses just require hands-on; they need to. But absent that, trying to be flexible, open-minded, evaluating your team members and where and how they operate best, creating those clear expectations, creating those systematic, regular communication touch points, I think are a good start.
Yeah, I would agree. Al, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way to contact you in your company?
Sure. So if they want to contact me personally, my email address is al@CultureWise, all one word, culture and wise, al@CultureWise.com. If they want to check out our company, no surprise, our website is CultureWise.com. We do, I know everyone says this, Patrick, but if you've been on our site, we do produce a lot of good content that we just kind of freely share on the topic. So if there are any other culture geeks out there that we have lots of materials, we do a very comprehensive biweekly blog. We have lots of videos on the topic, lots of white papers and things. So a great resource. And I'm always happy to help, even if it's just a conversation. Always happy to help. Just passionate about the topic and looking to help as much as I can.
Well, there's certainly a huge need for it. So thanks for taking the time to share what you guys are doing.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Best of luck.
Same, Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.